Hi, everybody. This week, I get to talk to you all about public relations and something that I look at in my own research called corporate social responsibility, which isn't in your textbook, but I'm hoping you'll see as connected to public relations. We'll get to that at the end of the second part of the lecture. The lecture will make a lot more sense, of course, if you've skimmed chapter 12 on public relations. Just to give you guys a very quick outline of how this lecture is broken down, we're going to start with the history of PR and its relationship to propaganda, branding, advertising, and journalism, and a little bit about how it's practiced and performed, and how PR relates to democracy and lobbying will come up a little bit more in the second section. From here, we're going to talk a little bit more about the concept of framing and look at some examples of how we saw governments frame conversations around COVID-19 in particular, which will connect to your reading from Dr. Melissa Aronchik this week. And finally, we will look at some models of CSR, or corporate social responsibility, and how corporations have taken up philanthropy and certain kinds of visibility around social issues as a means of branding and crisis management. And then finally, we'll just try to think a little bit about how media studies research and criticality that we've been looking at throughout the semester can help us think through and respond to the messaging that we're receiving through PR. Public relations has a long relationship to many forms of media that we've already discussed throughout the semester. But what makes it particularly interesting is that it is not a kind of media itself, right? So most of this semester, we've been looking at forms of media. So sound or images and film. And what we're looking at now is a kind of communication that makes use of other kinds of media, which is also true for what Dr. Brodich was talking to you about in advertising. So through this lecture, we'll look at how PR uses and differs from, or sometimes doesn't, advertising, propaganda, journalism, and entertainment. So what exactly is public relations, though? Your textbook gives us a quote from the Public Relations Society of America, the PRSA, and they define public relations as a strategic process that builds mutually beneficial relations between organizations and their publics. So the notion that it is mutually beneficial is tied to an industry definition of what PR is. However, public relations is not only difficult to distinguish from other forms of media, it's also important. It's difficult to distinguish from other forms of communication to audiences with an agenda to persuade. So whether that be advertising or propaganda. So this quote, for instance, says the total communication strategy conducted by a person, a government, or an organization attempting to reach and persuade an audience to adopt a point of view. Just as a personal exercise, when you read that, do you think that sounds like a definition of public relations, or does it sound more like a definition of propaganda? This definition is, in fact, actually a definition of public relations as well. So while they is focusing on mutually beneficial relationships, our book gives us a stronger definition. PR is a means by which the makers of media use stories and feelings to provoke and persuade an audience to adopt a particular point of view. So the logic of public relations is focused always on persuasion of an audience. This definition, importantly, does not in any way suggest that this is necessarily beneficial to anyone but the client who is trying to persuade. So it doesn't mean, of course, that PR can't be beneficial to an audience. PR can be interested in the social good, but it isn't its defining characteristic. Its defining characteristic is that it is interested in persuasion. Propaganda, similarly, is defined as a communication just strategically placed either as advertising or publicity in order to gain public support for a special issue, program, or policy, such as a nation's war effort, which this is a very famous image of. Historically, we think of propaganda as having been enacted by governments, although interestingly, ministries of propaganda or departments of domestic diplomacy have now become largely taken up by hired independent PR firms. So the work that used to be done by departments internal to governments, in many cases, are now being done by independent PR firms. And this is not only true in the United States, but in many countries. And Dr. Aronchik has a book about this called Branding the Nation, where she looks at how this happened and how we moved into private PR firms managing propaganda. So the line has gotten even blurrier than it already was. So we'll step a little bit back into the history of PR now. PR is not only connected to propaganda, but it also has a very close historical relationship to advertising and journalism. So the precursor to public relations firms were press agents. And press agents primarily worked with entertainers and staged events, and they planted newspaper stories to help manage their clients' images and draw interest and create public perceptions about the people they represented. Your book in particular notes that P.T. Barnum, whom some of you may know primarily as having run circuses and freak shows, actually was one of the first people to be credited as this kind of a figure of press agent. Your book has a number of interesting historical examples of this, but for now, we'll just look at one of them. One critical example is Davy Crockett, who has songs and movies and was very popular in the mid 20th century as a figure of the Wild West, was actually someone who was instrumental in the government-led massacre of millions of indigenous people. But through the work of press agents at the time, his story became a narrative about an American hero and an adventurer, a narrative which helped him to become eventually a politician. And for many generations, a kind of folk hero, certainly not for our time. PR is about these kinds of stories that we tell and how we tell them. So in our advertising and even in our news, which is supposed to be about fact, if you remember back to the history of journalism, all of our stories are inflected with feeling, and they often reappear or cross over into fictional media, as we see in this movie poster from the 1950s portraying Davy Crockett as a hero. He would have been a popular Halloween costume at the time, for instance. So this happens is through an appeal to certain ideals or values that we have emotional attachments to. There are ways that our emotions are affected by the stories that are told. So for David Crockett, that was always the story of rugged individualism and the American myth about how the frontier was won by brave individuals striking out on their own, rather than by large government-led land grabs and policies of exterminations of millions of people. In addition to early press agents, early advertisers also contributed to PR and really built this structure of appealing to emotions. Lee, often called poison ivy, is reputed to have had a flexible relationship to the truth and very little respect for his audiences. So he famously said in 1917, "Since crowds do not reason, they can only be organized and stimulated through symbols and phrases." So in other words, he thought of audiences as stupid and primarily being best manipulated through things that would speak to their emotions and strongly held ideals. In an early instance of crisis management, and we'll talk about crisis management a little bit more when we talk about strategies of PR, Lee was hired in 1914 by the Rockefeller family, who owned the company Standard Oil, to contain damaging publicity after violent tactics were used by agents that had been hired by Standard Oil to stop union organizing by workers in the company. And those actions killed 53 workers and their family members at a work camp, including 13 women and children. Over the years, Lee completely transformed the wealthy family's image after this event, urging the Rockefellers to really publicize charitable work and cultural philanthropy to the point where now I think most of us think primarily of the Rockefellers as Rockefeller Center in New York or other cultural institutions. His successor, Edward Bernays, was the nephew of the famous founder of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. And Bernays made key contributions to public relations, specifically as a field that one could study, and took a lot of his insights from his uncle's work in psychology. He taught the first class on public relations at NYU in 1923 and wrote the first textbook for the field called Crystallizing Public Opinion around the same time. For many years, his definition of PR was the standard, and that definition is public relations is the attempt by information, persuasion, adjustment to engineer public support for an activity, cause, movement, or institution. The notion of engineering public opinion is one that he's often credited with. Through much of his writing, Bernays suggested that emerging freedoms threatened the established hierarchical order. He thought it was important for experts and leaders to control the direction of American society. He said that the duty of the higher strata of society, the cultivated, the learned, the expert, the intellectual, if we think back to the Tower concept of culture, clearly Bernays thinks the people who are at the top should remain at the top and should be in control of everyone else. He said that they must be personally responsible for injecting moral and spiritual motives into public opinion. He was also famously hired by tobacco companies, and one of the videos I included for you guys this week is very much about this. So Bernays and his business partner and also his wife were responsible for a campaign to encourage women to smoke. They did this in a number of ways. One was by appealing to fashion designers and paying them to use more of a certain shade of green in their collection so that the packaging of Lucky Strike cigarettes would appeal more to women and be seen as fashionable. And as the video talks about in greater detail, Bernays also staged an event placing women smokers in the 1929 New York Easter Parade. So contemporary PR has evolved from these origins, but it still concerns the same interests and engages in many of the same tactics. PR firms work primarily to manage the images and public opinions of their clients or their clients' campaigns in various ways. So they work with the press to publish stories in print or other media. They handle crisis management when their clients have lost public favor. They stage special events or pseudo events. They suggest and create advertising and press. They lobby or work with lobbyists in order to gain government support for their clients' interests. So PR doesn't stay only in the realm of creating messages for audiences. It also has now come to cross into policy work much more than in historic periods. So crisis management has been a central part of PR since Ivy Lee's management of the story of the deaths of the Ludlow strikes. Occasionally, in times of crisis, such as a scandal at a university or a safety recall by a car manufacturer, a PR spokesperson might be designated as the only source of information available to news media, and they work to control the message to repair the client's image. One of the ways they do this, of course, is to point blame back at another source. So in the Ludlow case, Lee planted a story that noted that the women and children who died while retreating from the charging company-backed militia had overturned a stove, and that had caught fire, and that was what was responsible for their deaths. So it wasn't the militia, it was the carelessness of the people running from the militia. One of his PR fact sheets implied that they had in part been victims of their own carelessness. So your book provides several more recent examples as well. BP, or British Petroleum's 2010 oil spill. The case is one of really poorly managed crisis management by the PR firm. BP provided underestimations of the amount of oil leaking. The company chair referred disparagingly to the small people of the Gulf region, and the CEO complained of his own personal suffering and even attended an elite yacht race in England as the oil leak persisted. So people felt that BP failed to show enough remorse or compassion for the affected people and the wildlife. In comparison, the Starbucks crisis management in response to an incident of racial discrimination, when a manager at a Philadelphia store called the police on two African-American men because they were sitting in the store but had not ordered anything. Starbucks, of course, very publicly apologized and even closed its stores for a day of what it was referring to as racial sensitivity training for employees, and then launched a campaign to encourage discussions of race in Starbucks with cups printed with hashtag race together on them. Many PR organizations counts this campaign as largely successful in the way that they train workers. However, there was a great deal of criticism of this campaign as well. People pointed out that it was a cynical use of apology as a method of deterring responsibility, and cited instances where race together and sensitivity training put Black and POC workers in really uncomfortable positions where they had to educate their white coworkers and customers about race. And of course, we're not compensated for that extra work. So another way PR works to gain publicity and public favor is through creating events. So not unlike what we talked about with Bernays and smoking, or press agents and P.T. Barnum's events. Special events often includes corporate sponsorship. So the corporation aligns itself with a cause or an organization that has a positive stature and social opinion. So an example of this is funding marathons. Many people in the queer community have been deeply critical of the way that banks have sponsored a lot of pride parades as a way to garner support for their corporations as well. And then the second version of this is a pseudo event, circumstances created for the sole purpose of gaining the coverage in the media. So something like the marathon or pride parades happen independently of whether or not they're funded by these corporations, whereas a pseudo event is something that exists solely for the purpose of PR. So these might include press conferences, TV and radio talk show appearances that are negotiated by a PR firm on behalf of a client, staged activities that draw on public attention and media coverage. Your book notes some interesting early press agent events staged to draw newspaper attention, like we noted, so P.T. Barnum and others. So since the earliest days of public relations has been seen as deeply in tension with democracy. Some, like Bernays, even arguing that it's an essential aspect of democracy that we have the freedom to persuade rather than the freedom from being persuaded, while others obviously see it from the opposite standpoint and argued that PR interrupts the process of democracy in two important ways. One, by interfering with the government through the use of lobbying, and second, by interfering with the free press and journalistic integrity. And many of the stories that we read in the press, especially shorter pieces, are often pre-written by press agents and public relations firms. So lobbying emerges in the 19th century alongside press agents. And around 1850, railroads began pushing for federal subsidies. The Illinois Central was one of the first companies to use government lobbyists. So these are people who tried to influence the voting of lawmakers on key issues in order to argue that the railroad service between the North and the South was of public interest and would ease tensions, unite the two regions, and prevent war. So, of course, this is before the Civil War. Since that time, government PR specialists have focused the strategies of PR on winning government favor for their clients. Government PR specialists monitor new and existing legislation. They create opportunities to ensure favorable publicity, and they write press releases and direct mail letters to persuade the public about the pros and cons of these new regulations, always obviously in favor of their clients. Both PR firms and PR divisions within major corporations, they're both interested in making sure that government regulation neither becomes burdensome nor reduces their control over their own businesses. So in many industries, government relations evolved into lobbying and the process of attempting to influence lawmakers in very direct ways to support a particular vote in favor of an organization or a tax structure or legislation around environmental controls, a number of different things. Because lobbying often has a long public image problem of its own, it has been seen as extremely negative and interfering with democratic policy. So a new form of less visible lobbying has emerged with the help of public relation firms and new media. And that is referred to as astroturf lobbying, phony grassroots public relations campaigns engineered by public relations firms. Instead of me telling you this, actually, John Oliver's AstroTurf episode is very good. Please go watch that. And there's a great Nation article that I will also link if anyone's interested in learning more about this on shadow lobbying. So journalists have historically had a very tense relationship with PR as well, and with press agents in particular. So if we return to our past discussion on investigative journalism and muckraking, we will see that the emergence of both investigative journalism and PR occur at roughly the same time. And this is not a coincidence. Journalism has a long held place in American democracy as the fourth estate, the fourth aspect of government, effectively acting as a checkpoint to political power of the existing government. This is often seen to be threatened by the encroachment of PR on the press, where the press are now largely dependent on press agents and PR firms for information, in part because, as we've seen previously, staff writers are being drastically reduced. There's a need to produce massive amounts of content because of the 24/7 news cycle, all of which means that PR firms, which have more money and more time, can devote more resources on behalf of their clients to creating content for all of these spaces. They're not fact-checked, they're not investigated, and so it becomes very difficult to see where what we're looking at is really a news story or is it a press release masquerading. So while politicians have used PR firms since the beginning of the industry, the presidency of Donald Trump, who had been a reality TV star before he became a politician, has been studied as representing a new era of influence of PR in the communications of governments to people, and has given us an example of a president who vocally bites back at journalists and their longstanding role as part of democracy and its criticisms of the government at times. His antagonisms of journalism suggested that, in his view, it was investigative journalism that was the threat to democracy during his presidency, and this is evidenced with he and his cabinet coining phrases that you're all probably very familiar with, like alternative facts and fake news. Regardless, it's very clear that he utilized strategies of PR. In our next slide, we will see an example of PR Trump's use in the early days of COVID of what is referred to as a VNR. A VNR is a video news release, so like a press release, but it looks like a news story that then could be aired in many spaces. And it's how PR firms pitch story ideas to TV news media by mimicking the style of broadcast news reports. And this is not something that one would typically have ever seen in a government press conference before, where one is expected to meet the press, answer their questions, that they then go and turn into stories. Screening a VNR at a press release is a very unprecedented choice, right? So here's an example of that.
So the story in the New York Times was a total fake. It's a fake newspaper, and they write fake stories. And someday, hopefully in 5 years when I'm not here, those papers are all going out of business because nobody's going to want to read them. But now they like them because they write about me. Now, with that, I have a couple of we have a few clips that we're just going to put up. We could turn the lights a little bit lower. I think you'll find them interesting. And then we'll answer some questions. I'll ask you some questions because you're so guilty, but forget it. But most importantly, we're going to get back onto the reason we're here, which is the success we're having. Okay? Please, you can put it on.
People should be more concerned right now with the flu in this country.
A lot of people are concerned about the coronavirus because they're hearing a lot of news about it right now. But the reality is, comparing it to the flu, for example, it's not even close to being at that stage.
What if it is worse? Is this a moment where maybe countries put politics aside, a little bit of pride aside, and do we have U.S. officials? Should U.S. professionals such as yourself get involved?
How worried should Americans be about coronavirus?
Coronavirus is not going to cause a major issue in the United States.
Well, we've asked them to accelerate whatever they're doing in terms of a vaccine. We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. To unleash the full power of the federal government in this effort today, I am officially declaring a national emergency. Medicare patients can now visit any doctor by phone or video conference at no additional cost.
The first 1 million masks will be available immediately.
As there were more cases, and it was clear that it was spreading out of China, where it originated. The president took this move that he was widely criticized for by Democrats and even some Republicans at the time, which was he halted a number of flights from China into the U.S. The idea was to halt the spread of the disease, keep transmissions to a minimum. He was accused of xenophobia. He was accused of making a racist move. At the end of the day, it was probably effective, because it did actually take a pretty aggressive measure against the spread of the virus.
His team is on it. They've been responsive late at night, early in the morning, and they've thus far been doing everything that they can do, and I want to say thank you, and I want to say that I appreciate it.
He returns calls. He reaches out. He's been proactive. We got that Mercy ship down here in Los Angeles. That was directly because he sent it down here. 2,000 medical units came to the state of California, these FMS, these field medical stations, and that's been very, very helpful.
The president has been outstanding through all this. The vice president's been outstanding. Members of the coronavirus task force, very responsive.
We had asked if New Jersey could have access to a piece of the beds that are on the USNS Comfort, and the president came back, called me a short few minutes before I walked in here to say indeed they would grant that to New Jersey. So that's a big step for us in addition to all the other capacity. That news is literally hot off the press, and I thank the president and vice president who are on the call together.
President Trump approved Arizona's request for a presidential major disaster declaration. I want to thank the president for a quick turnaround. We requested this on a Wednesday, and we had approval by Saturday morning. And we are grateful to the administration for their continued support and responsiveness.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the president and the vice president for doing a really good job of communicating with all the governors.
So we could give you hundreds of clips like that from governors, including Democratic, or Democrat as I call them, governors, which is actually the correct term. We could give you hundreds of clips just like that. We have them. We didn't want this to go on too long, but I just want to say it's, it's very sad when people write false stories like In that case, I guess it was gotten mostly from the New York Times, which is a highly, I mean, if you had libel laws, they would have been out of business even before they'll end up going out of business.
Remember, this was in April of 2020. And at this point, we had still really not properly addressed a lot of things. And so this was largely a way of managing public opinion without him having to actually address the press or answer their questions. And when one journalist, Paula Reed, challenged the president for airing this video, because as I said, this is not a standard practice, and she called it a sizzle reel, which is not an inappropriate term for a VNR, and asked what it was supposed to produce in people, he tells her that she doesn't have the right to ask him these questions, and interrupted to denounce her and call her news channel, CBS, fake news, and point back to the VNR. Up until this point, what we've really been looking at is the history of public relations and some of its practices and connections to propaganda, journalism, and lobbying, and the tensions that arise around that. It's interesting and pertinent to our questions here, though, that the video screened by Trump and Reed's questions center around questions of feelings, right? So what she asks him is how the American people are supposed to feel, knowing that this is what he chose to do, is to spend money creating a VNR rather than answering questions for a concerned and scared public. So in the next section of this lecture, we're going to be returning to this definition of PR as a strategy of communication that persuades, to look more deeply at how it actually achieves that goal of persuasion and how that strategy and methods have moved beyond the field itself. So in particular, we're going to look at how PR has made feelings central to how the information we receive about politicians, ideas, companies, institutions, etc., are framed. And then we'll look at some specific instances of corporate PR and some government framing, and think about the emotional appeals that have been implemented in specific campaigns and new forms of corporate communication. So I'm going to stop this video here. And if you haven't already, please go watch the YouTube video with explaining the concept of framing. And it's in your linked videos. Watch that before you come watch the second half of the lecture.